No?
You know what?
They last longer.
Get the hammer out.
All right, if everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. We are going to start with a moment of silent reflection for first responders and members of the armed forces, followed by an invocation by Minister Jack White of the Gifford Church of God, and that will be followed by the Pledge of Allegiance by Commissioner Solari. So if everybody will please rise and join me in a moment of silent reflection.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we come together with bowed heads and humble hearts. We thank you for waking us up this morning in our right minds and our good health. We know, dear Heavenly Father, that you so loved the world that you gave your only begotten Son, that whosoever believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. We ask, dear Heavenly Father, that you watch over those who govern our local government, who govern our state government, our national government, and world governments. That the decisions that they make will be for the well-being of all mankind. We ask, dear Heavenly Father, that you continue to bless us as a nation. Help us to love more, help us to understand more, and most of all, to be more caring one for another. And protect us from the crisis of the coronavirus. And we ask that you help those who have already been infected by the virus. Please continue to bless us from seen and unseen dangers at all times. Now may the grace of our Lord and sweet communion of his Holy Spirit rest and abide with us forevermore. In agreements, let us all say, Amen.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. Commissioners, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda?
Madam Chair, there was a replacement page for item 8L. I think everybody received that, but just to make sure that's reflected in the agenda change.
Okay,
And
Madam
move.
Chair, move approval.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Our next items will be proclamations and presentations. Our first presentation will be a presentation of proclamation designating the month of March 2020 as March for Meals Month. I believe Ms. Deagle is going to be here to present. Thank you. It's my pleasure to read a proclamation designating the month of March 2020 as March for Meals Month. Whereas on March 22nd, 1972, President Richard Nixon signed into law a measure that amended the Older Americans Act of 1965 and established a national nutrition program for seniors 60 years of age and older. And whereas Meals on Wheels America established the National March for Meals campaign in March 2020 to recognize the historic month, the importance of Older Americans Act nutrition programs, both congregate and home delivered, and raise awareness about the escalating problem of senior hunger in America. And whereas the 2020 Observance of March for Meals campaign provides an opportunity to support Meals on Wheels programs that deliver vital and critical services by donating, volunteering, and raising awareness about senior hunger and isolation. And whereas Older Americans Act nutrition programs, both congregate and home delivered, in Florida have served our communities admirably for more than 40 years. And whereas Volunteer drivers for Meals on Wheels programs in Florida are the backbone of the program, not only delivering nutritious meals to homebound seniors and individuals with disabilities, but with care, concern, and attention to their welfare. And whereas Meals on Wheels programs in Florida provide nutritious meals to seniors throughout the state, helping them maintain their health and independence, avoiding unnecessary hospitalizations and/or premature institutionalizations. And whereas Meals on Wheels programs in Florida provide a powerful socialization opportunity for millions of seniors to help combat loneliness and isolation. Now, therefore, be it proclaimed by the Board of County Commissioners, Indian River County, Florida, that the month of March 2020 be designated as March for Meals Month in Indian River County, and the board encourages all citizens to take time this month to honor our Meals on Wheels programs run by the Senior Resource Association, the seniors they serve, and the volunteers who care for them. Our recognition of and involvement in the National 2020 March for Meals campaign can enrich our entire community and help combat senior hunger and isolation in America. Adopted this third day of March and signed by all 5 county commissioners. Welcome, Ms. Siegel. It's always a pleasure to do this proclamation. I don't get to do Meals on Wheels as much as I used to, but it's a great program and we appreciate what you do. Do you want to talk a little bit about
I do. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Deagle. I'm the CEO with the Senior Resource Association. And during this month of March, we joined thousands of Meals on Wheels programs across America, raising awareness among senior hunger and isolation. Senior hunger and isolation are serious problems in this community. Food insecurity affects seniors differently. Even if a person has the money to purchase food, they may not be able to because lack of mobility, functional limitations, and/or health problems. These reasons can prevent older adults from eating properly. Our Meals on Wheels homebound meal program helps alleviate isolation and hunger. A hot, nutritious meal is delivered by our staff and volunteers to our clients 5 days each week, and 2 frozen meals on the weekend, for the weekend. All meals are planned and evaluated by a registered dietitian to ensure 1/3 of the daily nutritional value is necessary, is provided in that meal. But we all know that this program is more than just delivering that daily meal. It's also a daily wellness check. Our Meals on Wheels programs also include senior social dining sites, which are perfect for mobile seniors and that are not able to prepare meals on their own or simply enjoy the company of others. Emergency Meals on Wheels is a program for seniors who have been discharged from a healthcare facility within the last 30 days. A hot, nutritious meal is delivered daily 2 to 4 weeks at no charge, and during the time that they're recovering. And this program, by the way, is funded completely through philanthropic funding. And lastly, and one of our favorites, is the Pet Meals on Wheels program, which provides our clients' pets with the right type of food so that clients don't share their food with their beloved pet, which, as we all know, is not good for the pet and also will lack nutrition for the person, the client that's receiving the meal. Overall, because of our generous volunteers and donors, last year, Senior Resource Association Meals on Wheels program provided 137,412 meals to seniors in Indian River County. This daily feat of providing well over 300 meals each day could not be accomplished without the dedication, time, and effort of over 115 volunteers on a weekly basis. However, even all this good stuff that I just said, right now, today, there is 181 seniors on our wait list needing to receive a daily meal. Senior Resource Association has the capacity to provide and deliver those meals. We just lack the funding for it. The cost to feed a senior on this program is $3,000 for the year. And again, on March 23rd, 24th, and 25th, Senior Resource Association is once again hosting the Champion for Meals, which is a really wonderful opportunity for community leaders like yourself and members of our community to experience the gratification of delivering a nutritious meal to our clients in their homes. I know many of you have participated in the past, and I'm hopeful that you'll consider doing it again, and allowing yourself to visit a few of our clients in their homes, because I know they do enjoy having that visit from you. So thank you again for this proclamation and allowing me a few minutes to talk about the Meals on Wheels program in our community. Thank you.
Thanks for all you do.
Thank you, Karen.
On three, 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
All right. Our next presentation or proclamation will be on partnering with the 2020 census to ensure an accurate count for Indian River County, presented by Commissioner Solari to Ms. Amy Hill. Welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for coming today. I am happy to read this proclamation on partnering with the 2020 census to ensure an accurate count for Indian River County. Whereas an accurate census count invigorates our community's development in the upcoming decade by impacting funding decisions for critical local services, including schools, health clinics, after-school programs, public transportation, roads, school lunch programs, playgrounds, and community centers for seniors. And whereas more than $400 billion per year in federal and state funding is allocated to states and communities based in part on census data. And whereas census data determines how many seats each state will have in the U.S. House of Representatives, and often is used for redistricting state legislatures and local voting districts. And whereas the 2020 census stimulates economic growth by creating local jobs, especially as census takers who verify our community receives an accurate enumeration. And whereas the information collected by the census is confidential and protected by law under Title 13 U.S. Code. Now therefore, be it proclaimed by the Board of County Commissioners of Indian River County, Florida, that as a 2020 census partner, Indian River County supports the goals of the census, encourages its citizens to participate in events that raise overall awareness and ensure a full, accurate count, and seeks opportunities to collaborate with other like-minded groups in our community to advocate on behalf of the 2020 census. Adopted this third day of March 2020 and signed by all 5 members of the Board of County Commissioners. Good morning and welcome.
Morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Amy Hill. I'm a partnership specialist with the U.S. Census Bureau in Indian River County. I'd like to thank the County Commission for your support of the 2020 census. I'd also like to thank Chairman Adams for forming and chairing the county's Complete Count Committee. The Complete Count Committee is a passionate group of community members who have been working very hard, along with many other organizations in the community, to increase the response rate in our county, which will then bring an increase in federal dollars to our community each year for the next 10 years. Now, because those federal dollars follow the count in Indian River, not the need, it is extremely important that we all work together to get the word out, educate, explain to people what the census is, why it's important, why they need to do it, and encourage each person to respond this year. As a quick note, the census day is April 1st. In mid-March, postcards will be mailed to each address, inviting people to go online and respond. They can do so online, or they can also call in if they're more comfortable. Each and every person in your household is counted. It's a very short 10-question questionnaire. And just another reminder that it is all confidential. The data collected cannot be shared with any other entity. So thank you again for the proclamation, and encourage everyone to participate. Thank you.
We'll get counted.
Good luck counting them all.
Yeah. One day we're gonna find out where all these photos go.
We have a good investment return on those.
1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
I think it was $400. That'll be well spent. We'll turn that into money.
Yeah, but glad you didn't give them away to like city council.
Auction them off afterwards.
Save them for 10 years and use them again.
Just change the number.
All right, thank you for that. The next item, there is no minutes for approval. The next items are informational items and then we'll move on to the consent agenda. I believe that staff wanted to pull 8L to update the backup. correct?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Anybody else need to pull anything from consent? Anybody from the public wishing to pull anything from consent?
Madam Chair, move approval as amended.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Flesher and a second by Commissioner Zork. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Jason, did you?
Sure, yes, so we have one change to the miscellaneous budget amendment. It is on item 6 for the emergency sand that was placed on the dunes at Golden Sands Park. We had a change in funding source from the Beach Restoration Fund to the MSTU Fund to be consistent with the funding for that. So that is the only change. So with that, staff recommends approval.
Okay.
Move approval. Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Flesher, a second by Commissioner O'Brien. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The next item is a public hearing on the disposition of real property ordinance.
Thank you very much. On February 4th, the board authorized the county attorney's office to finalize an ordinance concerning the disposition of real property. The ordinance was to include 4 alternative procedures, which were a minimum base bid, a negotiated sale, coordinating with FDOT, and finally, an RFP process. Each process has its advantages, and all would be available for consideration when the disposal of county real property. After the board meeting, staff expressed an interest in including the use of these different alternatives when the county considers not only the sale of the property, but also a lease of county property. County Attorney's Office has incorporated that modification into the draft ordinance that is presented to the board for consideration this morning. County Attorney's Office recommends that the chair open the public hearing, take any public comment and consider such public comment, and then vote to approve the ordinance as presented. Just want to thank various different departments who were helpful in this. Budget, budget, purchasing, and public works were all helpful in coming up with very good suggestions and assisting with the ordinance. And with that, I turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you. At this time, I will open the public hearing. Anybody from the public wishing to speak on this item, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record. Welcome.
Hi, Bob Alberter, Vice Mayor of Indian River Shores. I just had one question with the board, that one of the options was to use a real estate broker, and that, as I understood, the discussion would be with county staff, presumably the county administrator or who he designated. Just one question, with that type of procedure, would any of those discussions or records, memoranda or so forth be subject to the public records law?
I haven't looked into the specific public records exemptions or non-exemptions, but clearly we'd have to meet the statutory requirements for the public records items. Usually when we have a purchase and sale of property, there are documents that are confidential for a period of time, we would follow those timelines.
Oh, okay, because we considered this at Indian River Shores as a different situation than the county. We ended up selling property via an auction because we were concerned about the discussions with the council would necessarily be out there in the public. So that would be like if one of you were selling your property and having a discussion with a real estate broker, I want to buy it, I'm standing there listening back to the discussion back and forth. So that would be my only concern, to make sure that you could have a situation where you could have some level of confidentiality so you're not giving away the store. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, any comments, questions, or concerns for staff?
Move staff recommendation.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner O'Brien, second by Commissioner Solari. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And with that, we'll move on to our next public hearing, which is consideration of alternative land development regulation, amendment proposals to define, regulate, and establish criteria for off-site accessory landscaping services in agricultural zoning districts. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm Roland DeBlois, County Planning Director. I do have a brief PowerPoint presentation on this item. Just a little background. Back in March, on March 5th, 2019, Mr. Spencer Simon and Tim Campbell were heard by the County Commission under public discussion regarding an off-site landscaping services business, Caribbean Lawn Landscaping, that was established on 37th Street in the agricultural zoning district. At that time, they expressed concerns about the traffic effects on the neighborhood, precedent for similar businesses in agricultural areas, and the scale of the use and the structure on the property associated with the business. Code enforcement case was discussed. This case, the Caribbean Landscape, did go to code enforcement. The main issue was they established the landscaping, off-site landscaping services business prior to establishing the principal on-site nursery. Resulted in a code enforcement case. It went through the code enforcement process. They did plant the nursery after the fact to a scale that met the current code requirements, so that case was closed, but it was part of the discussion. Here's just a basic aerial of the site and showing the large structure towards the front of the property. It's about just under 10 acres. At that meeting and under that discussion, the Commission expressed concerns about the landscaping services business. The term gaming the system was used as far as the question on whether the tail was wagging the dog as far as the landscaping business and the on-site tree nursery. The potential for the accessory business being out of scale with the wholesale nursery and ag areas. And as a result of that discussion, the Commission directed staff to research possible county code modifications to balance the agricultural and business uses in the agricultural areas. Staff did that and came back to the board on June 18th, 2019, and reported its findings. It also, staff presented a draft proposed code amendment that would more specifically define what constitutes an allowable landscaping services business, accessory to a whole-scale nursery in ag areas. After discussions at that meeting and public input, the Commission directed staff to, and the Agricultural Advisory Committee for staff to work with that committee to review the issues in general associated with the ag use conflicts and uses in the area. And during this process, two separate amendments were proposed by citizens. We call them the Simmons-Campbell Amendment, based on who submitted it, and also the Hendricks Amendment, which I'll go into later on in this presentation. So we have a number of amendments that are here for the board to consider today. The areas most at issue are the A1 or Ag 1 zoning areas, 1 unit per 5 acres, east of 95 and up in the Fellsmere area. This is where you tend to have the more mix of uses as you're closer to the urban service area. When this went to the Ag Advisory Committee, some of the discussion items were the land use conflicts in agricultural areas, inevitable mix of uses, particularly as you get towards the urban service area of agriculture, residential businesses, and low-density rural and remote areas. The other things that were discussed with the Ag Advisory Committee were the state preemptions for agriculture and related uses. For example, agritourism is now preempt from local regulation as an example. So there's more uses over the past years that are preempted from regulation at the local level if they're tied to bona fide agriculture, including a preemption on building permit requirements if it's a non-residential ag structure. On that point, with regard to structures and permitting, staff uses the voluntary verification ag exemption form to give both the citizens and the county a review for confirmation as to whether a structure is ag exempt. So under the current code requirements in the agricultural zoning districts, commercial nurseries allowed as permitted use, and within that use category, within the zoning, it specifies that wholesaling and off-site landscaping services are allowed in conjunction with commercial nurseries, with no retail sales allowed on site. Staff has interpreted that such that off-site landscaping services component is necessarily accessory to wholesale nursery use. It's incidental to and associated with subordinate and area and located on the same principal use property. So, and that was the approach that was is used currently and was used in the Caribbean landscape instance, which I've referenced. So for a nursery to be established, the scale has to be, we don't have a specific definition as to the percentages of the scale of the accessory to the principal. So by default, as long as the accessory use is subordinate in size or less in aerial extent to the principal, that's how staff has provided. Otherwise, there are currently no real quantitative standards in the code. And in researching this whole issue, one of the things that staff looked at were existing nurseries throughout the county. At the June meeting, we presented a slideshow of about 17 different types. I'm not going to go do that again today here, but there are a number out there of different scales. And again, part of the process has been looking at what are some quantitative standards that could potentially be used and to try to address this issue. Again, some of this is what we presented back in June, but just a refresher. We did look at other counties in the area to see how they regulate or allow landscape services. And various counties allow wholesale landscaping services in agriculture as a permitted use without specific criteria. And in Indian River County, again, we interpret it currently as an accessory use. Palm Beach County applies some specific criteria related to minimum acreage and landscape buffering. And that back on the June 18th, 2019 meeting, when we came back to the board, we did have a staff draft ordinance at the time. And within that ordinance, staff took the definition approach, was essentially to pull in some specific criteria into the definition of off-site accessory landscaping services to include criteria on parcel size, setbacks, and buffering. Under that approach, the draft that the board saw back in June, there would be no permit required for the use, but it would still have to meet the criteria in order to be allowed. So that was the approach taken back in staff's draft ordinance back then. When it did go through the Agricultural Advisory Committee, they had 2 meetings in October and then in December, where they looked at that draft ordinance that was presented to the board in June, and they looked at other issues. And after review and discussion with a lot of participation from concerned citizens, they voted to recommend that staff develop an alternate amendment, which for reference, referring to as the second alternative, which was to essentially adopt similar criteria to what was presented to the board back in June, however, to make it an administrative permit use subject to site plan review and Planning and Zoning Commission approval. When we went into that meeting from a staff, one of the first approaches staff took was to recommend or consider the alternative of an administrative permit site plan review with a staff level approval. After discussion, the committee concluded that they were more supportive of it going to the Planning and Zoning Commission so that there would be a public meeting forum for that approval process. Even notwithstanding, under this approach, it would be Administrative permit is used that if the criteria are met, then the use is a by right use, if it meets the criteria. So getting a little more into that second alternative staff draft ordinance that the Ag Committee supported, it clarifies that allowable off-site landscaping use must be accessory to a legally established nursery, and it would not include standalone lawn mowing or standalone pest control services. It would exclude further regulation. This is just to acknowledge that this doesn't get into the issue of what we qualify as a home occupation permit. It specifies a minimum parcel size of 400,000 square feet or just over 9 acres. It calls for specific, or specifies 50-foot setbacks from property lines for the landscaping services portion, parking, driveway, and building area. It would limit the landscaping services area to 50% of the cultivated or nursery site area, which is different than what is currently interpreted. Right now, it could be essentially a 49-51 ratio. This would make it essentially like a 33 to 66% ratio as far as the area of the landscape services portion. A visual screening would be required for all parking area, driveway, building area from adjacent properties and streets. Also included is a specific prohibition on bringing in material for burning, stockpiling, organic material, or dumping of debris brought in from off-site onto the subject property. I mentioned that during this process we have two other formal LDR amendment applications that came through the process from citizens. The Hendricks proposal, under this proposal, it would make the off-site landscaping services and agricultural zoning districts a special exception use subject to specific criteria and public hearings with notice to surrounding property owners. Under a special exception use, a finding or a review is built into special exceptions to look for compatibility with surrounding property. So it's not a given so much as a by right use. It would be subject to the public hearings review. Under the Hendricks proposed LDR amendment, some criteria are proposed. Indoor facilities 50 feet from property lines, 500 feet from the nearest residence. Outdoor improvements, parking and driveways associated with the landscaping portion, 50 feet from property lines. Calls for noise impact mitigation as a potential condition. No landscaping services facilities on property less than 400,000 square feet if adjacent to a property with residents. You can see some of these criteria were pulled into the staff recommended ordinance. Landscaping employees and personnel shall be supervised by management when on site and entering and leaving the property. And then the next alternative based on the citizen application for LDR amendment, what we're calling the Simmons-Campbell proposal. Under this approach, it's essentially an elimination of the allowance of off-site accessory landscaping uses in the agricultural zoning district is what's recommended. Under the reasoning that it's a commercial business use, not an agricultural use. Some of the reasons explained are exploiting the agricultural exemptions, avoiding commercial property tax, building codes, impact fees, traffic and currency, and other laws typical to commercial businesses. There's also the position that such uses are incompatible with rural and agricultural activities. They're not required non-urban location or more appropriate in the commercial zoning. So just to summarize the alternatives that are before you as a commission to look at today, we have the first alternative is what we're calling it, the staff first alternative, which was presented back in June, which was to further define off-site landscaping services with criteria that would have to be met, but still allow it once they meet the criteria without a permit being required. The second alternative staff amendment, which is the alternative recommended by the Agricultural Advisory Committee, would define the use and establish criteria such as the buffering minimum parcel size, but it would also require administrative permit, site plan review process, subject to Planning and Zoning Commission approval. And then we have the Hendricks proposal, which is the special exception use determination subject to public hearings before the P&Z and the County Commission with notices surrounding property owners with specific criteria. And then finally, the Simmons-Campbell proposal, which would essentially just eliminate the allowance of the off-site accessory landscaping services in agricultural zoning districts under the premise it's a commercial use and more appropriate in a commercial zoning district. Now, this did go to the Planning and Zoning Commission at an advertised public hearing, and that occurred on January 23rd. And at that meeting, after discussion and input at the hearing, the board voted 5-0 to recommend the staff's second alternative, which would again establish criteria, but require administrative permit and Planning and Zoning Commission approval. Essentially, it's the same recommendation as the Agricultural Advisory Committee. Just a note, as far as existing landscaping services, and this was discussed during the process through the Ag Committee and P&Z, that any LDR amendment that the board would adopt would apply for moving forward. Any existing landscaping services that were legally established at the time they were established would be grandfathered under the county's nonconformities regulations. And under that, Chapter 904 nonconformities, what we're talking about is any increase or expansion of a legally established nonconforming use. It could not be expanded or increased. If it's discontinued for more than a year, that's also a trigger for it not being continued. And there's also a note to consider that if there is a change in the current use allowance in the county's code under use classification that affects real property, there's a potential conflict with private property rights protection under state law. So with that, staff's recommendation is that the county commission adopt staff's proposed alternative or second alternative LDR amendment, which would require off-site accessory landscaping services in agricultural zoning districts subject to the criteria summarized and be subject to Planning and Zoning Commission approval as an administrative permit. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, is there any questions of staff at this time?
I just have more of a comment than a question, Madam Chair. Roland, when this first came to us, the thing that always I had trouble understanding was the whole concept of the accessory and subordinate use. And in this particular instance with Caribbean landscaping, you know, and I guess looking at things like the number of people involved with the two uses. You might have had 50 workers on the landscaping side and I guess initially 0 workers on the nursery side. And now you may still have 50 landscaping guys, maybe 2 or 3 people working on the nursery side. And the same thing with the kind of looking at the finances, like the budget, you know, how much is invested in one activity compared to the other. And when I think of subordinate, I think that use is a lot less, both personnel-wise, budget amount, revenue amount, than the primary use. And with what's proposed here, I know that you're saying that the footprint can only be 50% of the nursery area footprint, but still, you know, you can cram a whole lot of stuff in that size footprint. And I still don't see here where we're really clearly defining that subordinate level and accessory use level. I think, again, even with what Caribbean's doing now, that the commercial landscaping is the primary business, and really the nursery is subordinate to, if you look at the people involved, the funding, the revenue. So I'm still struggling with how do we really clearly define something that's an accessory use that in my mind should be a lot less than the primary use. So just, I don't know if that's a question or comment, but just, I'm just having a hard time grabbing that.
Yeah, and that was there's long discussions on that in the Agricultural Advisory Committee. Representative did, on one side, the Ag Committee did recognize that for bona fide agricultural nurseries, and there is a off-site landscaping component. Sometimes they rely on that more than the other, depending on the circumstance. So there is a reluctance to fully just segregate it and say you can have a nursery, but you can't have off-site landscaping associated with it because it's
and I
intertwined. But I
do
understand your
that
point
part of it.
exactly as far as where do you draw the line as when it becomes the tail wagging the dog. And admittedly, currently our ordinance doesn't get into that, and we just default to the aerial extent. And as you're indicating, that's not really addressing the issue, so that's why we're here. This is what we came up with.
And I do understand, I remember Commissioner Adams, when this first came up, mentioned her family used to have a plant nursery, I believe, and that they would go and, put the trees in and then maintain them. And I think it's C.W. Willis, they have a similar thing. They have a pretty large nursery there off 58th Avenue. And I know our HOA bought a palm tree from them, and they came in, dug the hole, put the tree in, and did all that. So I understand there's that component of it, but when you have one vehicle that's dealing with digging the hole and installing the trees you sell, and then 15 others doing the commercial landscape business, to me, that teeter is too far on one side, just kind of.
And
So anyway,
just to add to that, I mean, that was, as staff said, there was long discussions at Ag Advisory on that type of thing, and that's one of the reasons why they recommended that this have some component of administrative permit and site plan review, and then go through planning and zoning. So there was more eyes on kind of what would be established at some point.
so I guess then a question maybe for Dylan then. If it does come to the P&Z, and if we haven't specified like some type of ratio of employees or revenue or something, would the P&Z still be able to make a ruling on the administrative permit use if those things aren't delineated? Or how much flexibility would P&Z have to say, you know what, we think this is just too much without any type of quantitative guidelines?
Well, whatever criteria you would have in there, we would certainly want it to be the type of thing that was objective. So, the P&Z and staff could review an application and say it meets this box, it checks this box, it checks this box, and therefore we're going to, approve it, as opposed to something that's more subjective, such as your traditional special exception criteria, such as, it's got to be consistent and compatible with adjacent properties. So if we're going to have the administrative approval process and have it go to P&Z under the staff 2 proposal, it would need to be objective. I don't know of any other uses, and I defer to the Community Development Department on this in terms of in which we count the number of employees or look at the budgets of businesses.
Can we, about like vehicle trips or something? And
Yeah.
I know this is a real, herding cats question, but to me, it just seems that what I've seen here isn't quite enough in my mind to be comfortable that the commercial landscaping is going to be subordinate and accessory and not still be able to be gamed that, okay, we can build this 2 or 3 story building and cram a lot of stuff in it, even with the reduced footprint, and that the commercial business will be the driver, and then the ag use is the subordinate accessory use. And
Well, I
again,
don't think we're going to find a solution that does all that, to be honest with you. I mean, it's just, there's only so much we can control and look into and regulate. And I don't, when we start talking about regulating or looking at budgets and employees and those types of things, it makes me uncomfortable being that involved in somebody's business. I think we can look at some of these things and the ancillary nature. And I mean, really and truly, something being ancillary or accessory means it's just less than the majority. So this is still better than where we were before, and it does provide a little bit more oversight and regulation. But I would just point out to my fellow commissioners that the ag zoning districts are not purely residential districts. This isn't like a large lot subdivision. This is a mixed use type district in which you already have commercial businesses out there doing other things. It might not be landscape, but you have farms that have people coming and going. You have all sorts of different activities happening out there. And while I understand that this use is very it provides a lot of traffic trips. The same could be said for some of the other uses out there, like petroalgae in Fellsmere when it was out there, or the shrimp farm that's down a dirt road out in Fellsmere. They have a lot of activity and trucks coming and going. So it's a fine line that we have to walk as to how we regulate and make sure everything is compatible out there, because you have so many uses that people are doing in the country. It's not just, I'm going to the country to live on my quaint little farm with my 2 horses and a cow. There's other things going on out there. There's people doing legitimate agribusinesses that are not going to necessarily be compatible with a residential area. It's just like if you move to a downtown, you have to understand that you are in an urban area where there's going to be stores and shops and other things happening. This is very similar, although obviously still different, but you have those mix of uses, and we're going to continue to see these types of conflicts as things develop and progress. I think that the Ag Advisory Committee took a lot of input from a lot of different people. They were long meetings with a lot of discussion on how do we get to the best place where we're protecting legitimate ag interests and the residential uses that are out there, and trying to craft something that kind of helped address the problem. But one of the issues with this particular situation was more related to code enforcement, to be honest with you, than it was to the LDR that's in front of us. So I just throw that all out there for thought.
And I agree with your point. I think if you do move out in an ag district, you would expect that, the guy next to you may have a pig farm going, and there would be an odor with that, or a citrus grove, and so they're going to be spraying chemicals. I think that I don't have any real sympathy for somebody that moves out there and then they complain about that, because those are ag, in my mind, true ag activities, a fish farm, any of those things. But I think when you bring in something that's not ag, that wasn't on the list of expected uses that they're having to deal with. But okay, well, anyway, so with the
Yes, still.
I just wanted to follow up on an answer I provided to Commissioner O'Brien. I will note, and I haven't gone through the whole criteria of all the different types of uses, but I did note that a criteria for places of worship did include that the project shall be determined by the Public Works Director to be a small traffic generator as provided in subsection 952.075A, less than 400 average daily trips. I was just saying that there's an example of something like that that is in the code. I'm not sure if that's appropriate for this use or not, but I just want to let you know that we do have those types of examples.
I do want to add to that, many of these developments may not trip the threshold to require a traffic study in the first place.
Right.
Phil Mattson, Community Development Director, and it's a handful out of the hundreds and hundreds of uses that we have that might have any kind of tie-in to number of employees and revenue. I don't know of any, first of all. ALFs, number of beds, I think under 5 and over 5 triggers another setback regulatory threshold and so forth. And this is a very tough issue. There are 2 things we cherish here in the county. Obviously, our idyllic, rural lifestyle, and the landscaping everywhere that we pride ourselves on, which depends upon landscaping businesses and that sort of thing. With respect to the landscaping employees, I've lived near 2 of these operations in my life, once here in Florida, once in North Carolina, other property I owned, and they do tend to come in mass upon the muster, if you will, at the site of the landscaping business, but then they leave pretty early on, and they're basically carrying out their operation not on site, if that makes any kind of difference, as opposed to the ag employees who are there on site all day with the, with the nursery type business. I really want to commend everybody on their patience with this process. I think that's ultimately what we can pride ourselves on here in the county, the fact that people think this through, and nobody's more methodological at things like this than Roland, I can tell you, and he's gotten quite a bit of input on it. I was kind of taken by Roland's chart. I think it's attachment 4, page 4, and it talks about the restrictions our neighboring counties put on these sorts of things. And I would argue, I don't know, Roland, I'll get your opinion on this, we probably have the most restrictions now of any of the adjacent counties. So I think Palm Beach has some restrictions here, conditional, but they allow them on 3-acre lots. We don't do that. In some places, they're just out and out permitted. So, we already do have a pretty restrictive set of codes, and we are proposing to make them even more so here.
Yes, I think that was the finding. The one that came closest to what we're moving towards under this proposal would be the Palm Beach County, which did establish certain size restrictions and buffering, which is one of the main issues that we were looking at.
So, Roland, could you please go back to the aerial photo you displayed of the Caribbean landscaping site? And then do you know, I think you said the total site was a little over 9 acres, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then do we know what the footprint is, how many acres is that, the shed and the paved area there?
The area is around 1.5 acres. They planted the back area to get over that amount. It's between 1.5 acres and 2 acres.
Okay, so again, if say there's a 10-acre parcel and they have 5 acres under the nursery aspect of it, under the proposed LDR, they can then use 50% of that for the accessory. Well, that'd be 2.5 acres, which is bigger than this site. You said it's about 1.5 acres at the most. So again, to me, that still leaves a very big footprint for the subordinate activity. And so one option is, could we lower that percentage to a lower amount, like 25% of the nursery area?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a magic number that staff came up with, the 50.
And that would be something that then the P&Z could use as a site plan review and all that?
Yes, that could be an objective criteria if the board decided to change that percentage.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so this is, I'm sorry, Commissioner Zorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple questions. And this is not picking sides, it's picking just some items that I'm a bit uncomfortable with. When you say the word site plan to planning and zoning, and this is in general, I don't like to overburden anybody to have to go through site plan. It just happens to be this is the one we're talking about today. If it was another land use, I'd be bringing up the same question. So on a 10-acre site or 9.18 acres, that would be a major site plan, correct? Because of the
Major
size.
site plan is based on the impervious surface over 5,000 square feet.
Okay. So this would mean, obviously you have to have a survey. You would hope they had a survey when they bought it. But can an applicant prepare this himself, or does he have to go out and hire an engineer and do a drainage study and a drainage calculation, a stormwater calculation, a stormwater permit, maybe yes or no on the tripping the 400 count traffic threshold? Probably not, because these are smaller. I don't want to layer so much burden on the site plan portion of this, and if, can the applicant do this himself, or does he have to hire all these consultants to get him through the process?
I'm going to ask John McCoy to help out with that answer.
Good morning, John McCoy with the County Planning Department, for the record. For a variety of these agricultural uses, we have had essentially folks do it themselves. Kennels are one, non-commercial kennels, commercial kennels, other sorts of ag uses where they're typically using a survey to begin with and then enhancing that survey information. Typically, if you get to a larger site, there may be some input from Public Works, and they may ask for, again, some more detailed information that would require potentially an engineer. Many of these things are going to be, if they're ag exempt, so the county's hands are tied from, looking at additional information. But a lot of our ag applicants have provided information based on a survey and added a lot of information themselves and gone through the process themselves.
Okay, and then by adding it going through P&Z, that wouldn't require them to do anything additional from what prior applicants have done, you don't think?
I would think it would be consistent with the prior applicants for
Okay.
commercial kennels, commercial stables, things like that,
Okay.
commercial kennels.
That's good. Don't go farther, maybe another one. Next one actually is for Dylan. So under the Right to Farm Act, can we require somebody that's under that, or is pursuing that avenue for their approval, can we require them to go to P&Z under the Right to Farm Act language?
So in my mind, what the Right to Farm Act protections and the type of uses that are, the type of uses that are protected under the Right to Farm Act are different from the types of things that are being considered under the accessory uses. So your landscaping business, your other types of businesses, I think those are separate and apart from your right to farm sort of protections.
Okay, so here's another scenario. It's not far from one of these. It's, I won't mention the business name. I know our active citrus area has decreased, but this company's been in business for, gosh, at least as long as I can remember, where they service the trimmers that go down the Grove aisle so that when they go to pick, they've got a nice square aisle to go through. So just counting on the aerial, they have about 25 trucks. They do welding, they run the equipment, they test the saw blades, they change the saw blades. What happens to that guy under this? He's not growing anything on his site, and he's, I'm guessing, about 10 acres in size. Is this type of operation protected going forward? So they're an ag support, but they're not doing any ag at all, at least. I've been by it a bunch of times looking on the aerial. It's mainly where they bring the equipment, they service it, they change the engine, they change the blades. The crews come in, they load up and head out, but there's no active agriculture operation on the site. It's more of a machine shop.
No pun intended, it's apples and oranges in this sense. The agricultural businesses are a separate category, if I'm not mistaken, and those are allowed in ag?
Correct. They're allowed through a special exception process. We have had a couple go through that process where they either be the construction and maintenance of like the speed sprayers or the
Right.
box cutters like you're talking about where they're trimming the groves. So
And,
those would continue on as a separate type of use.
in this case, the code currently calls out this use specifically, separately on the use list, so that's how it's regulated versus being put in the agricultural business category.
And I think what we're talking about is off-site accessory landscaping services is what we're addressing here. We wouldn't be changing any other land uses with this action.
But there was some discussion at Ag Advisory about what, slippery slope type of things. So that was actually an example that was used, so just to throw that in.
Okay. All right, that's all I have for now.
I do see a distinct difference, though. To me, it'd be different if they had a lawnmower repair service where I would bring my lawnmower and they would sharpen the blade, do the oil change, and I go home and mow my lawn. To me, that's not ag-related at all. But if you're working on equipment that's being used in an ag field, I see that clearly as two different things, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions of staff? Okay, this is a public hearing, so at this time, we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Anybody from the public wishing to speak on this item, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record.
Good morning. My name is Ken Hendricks, and I live at 6220 First Street Southwest. I live next door to one of these businesses that been a problem in the past, and they're at 6300 First Street Southwest. To start off, since there's been discussion about previous LDR amendments that had been filed, one of them was mine, one of them was the Simmons-Campbell proposal. Mine was the one that requested some site plan approval, but I made it clear in the beginning that the reason I filed this was to control expansion of facilities that already exist. It was never intended as a shoehorn to bring new businesses in that follow the same pattern. I support the Simmons-Campbell proposal to remove off-site landscaping from the agricultural districts. I really think it's the only way to resolve all the thorny little problems that Ms. Adams alluded to at the agriculture meeting. I'm also here to say that I'm not trying to fix my current problem, and I'm not trying to shut my neighbor's business down. I'm here to talk about the future. I'd like to talk about some history, but I don't claim to be a pioneer family. I do go back 35 years, but there's a lot of people that know a lot more about Indian River County history than I do. My first question would be, does anybody know who this man is? I bet there's some people here that do, and they're just not saying. This gentleman is R.D. Carter. And if it weren't for Mr. Carter, we probably wouldn't have a town, and we'd all be walking around knee-deep in water about 6 months of the year. What did Mr. Carter do? He created the drainage project for basically the whole county, probably at which time it was a part of St. Lucie County. And he provided the framework for Indian River Farms. This is an advertisement that Indian River Farms prepared on a postcard and sent it to people up north to see if he could get them to come down and buy 40-acre parcels and start farming in Indian River County. You note in the very foreground of that picture, there's a private home on the man's farm. And if you reverse that postcard, the little advertising spiel is spelled out. And in the beginning, it talks about being a 40-acre farm subdivision, attractiveness, horticultural, with variety of crops, dividing it into with roadways.
Mr. Hendricks, if I could ask you to we're dealing with the LDR changes, and I love the history of Indian River County, most certainly. I'm probably one of its biggest fans, but if we could get to the point, because we have other people that would like to speak as well.
Somebody just made fun of us who live out there and have 2 horses and a cow. So I'm trying to demonstrate that this has been a residential community from the get-go. On my street now, which was originally called R.D. Carter Road before it was changed to First Street Southwest, there are at least 4 homes under construction, 34 that already exist, and a PUD agricultural subdivision, which had to go through planning and zoning. There's been some downzoning of some property right on 66th Avenue at the head of the west end of Pine Tree Park. So at the same time the county is debating this issue, they're allowing more subdivisions, more density in the form of residential properties. There's Point West to consider. So it seems to me that we're only compounding the problem by playing both ends against the middle. I bought our property, or we did, my wife and I, Pam, in 1995, and this language did not exist in the zoning code at the time, because believe me, I checked. I reviewed the entire zoning code. And obviously at the time it wasn't there because it had not been modified, which occurred in 1997 when off-site landscaping was included after I had settled in. I went to the county, and when I heard that Tropical Property Management was going to move a business in next to my property, and I took them an aerial photograph of what that business looked like because it was currently in operation on 61st Street. And I told the county this was going to be a problem if this moved in next to my house. At the time, I tried to do things. I tried and attempted to file my LDR amendment allowing site plan approval at that time. And I'm not going to explain the bureaucratic obstacles I encountered, but I didn't do it then because by the time I got around to it, they had already moved in. I went to the county in 2015 and they moved in Memorial Day 2016. This is basically what it looks like today. And I really don't want to pass by this one section because I've tried to read this before, the purpose and intent under 911.06, to try to demonstrate that somebody in the past, when drafting the zoning ordinance, was providing for the very kind of residential neighborhoods that are there now. These districts are further intended to permit activities that require non-urban locations, do not detrimentally impact lands devoted to rural and agricultural activities. These districts are also intended to provide opportunities for residential uses at very low densities to promote housing opportunities in the county. So this idea of preserving what's there based upon the history of the way it was used all along has been in the discussion all along. This is another view of what's next door, and if you will note, what's next door is not next to my grove, it's right next to my house. Now, I think the heart of this entire problem, as Mr. O'Brien has already figured out, is this ratio issue. They modified the ratio. First they went to 2-to-1 on the temporary ordinance, and then they backed it down to less than 50%. So essentially they've gone from 50-50 to 49-51 in adjusting the ratio. But I think there's some serious issues with the ratio and the use of the ratio. It was never in the original code at all. It was something that staff made up to try to resolve the issue of an accessory and answer the question of it. It was a regulatory legislation. And I don't know if I was the first one to complain about it. It was the first time I realized it was going to be used is when I went there in 2015, when they stated that what was coming in next door to my house was going to be within the code. Well, what they meant and should have said was it meets their existing 50-50 ratio, which was the one that they made up and had started to use. Basically without any legislative authority. Now they want the legislature to put their imprimatur on it. It's kind of like that Georgia Tech game where the score was Georgia Tech 222 and Cumberland College 0, and they were in the locker room with the Cumberland team, and one guy says, why didn't you pick up that fumble? And the other guy says, well, you dropped it, you pick it up. So basically, they want the county commission to pick up their fumble and scoop and score and take their non-legislative regulatory feature and make it law. Roland points out too, and I still compliment Roland every time I come up here, he's got a heck of a job to do and he's a gentleman. He mentioned Bert Harris and the taking of property and the issues that might arise if you did grant the Simmons-Campbell amendment. But there's other issues that exist with the ratio itself. What about constitutional issues like void for vagueness, or being arbitrary, or being capricious, or failure to promote the reason for which it was established? And as I understand it, it was established to find some way to define an accessory. But there was already a definition of accessory in the code. Accessory use which is clearly incidental to, customarily found in association with, and serves a principal use, is subordinate in purpose, area, and extent to the principal use served. There's a long way between resolving those issues, whether it's at the county commission, at planning and zoning, or even in the code office itself, the staff office itself. There's a long way between these elements that are supposed to be explored when you're trying to determine if something is an accessory or not, and the use of a prophylactic ratio that solves all the problems at once. I think this would be a pretty good due process argument as an indefensible presumption. Now, what is tropical property management, my neighbor? If you look at their website, they are lawn maintenance, pest control, fertilization, landscape design, landscaping installations, services, which are the core of our business. I think they've basically answered the question of whether they're an accessory or not. They're clearly not an accessory. They're clearly the dominant party in that relationship. And what exactly is the service they offer? If you look back at the definitions again, you find down at the bottom what retail trade is. It's the sale of consumer goods, commodities, and services to ultimate consumers, which is exactly what every single one of these off-site landscaping companies do. They all serve the ultimate consumer. They are retailers. They may be on a parcel of land that's also occupied by a wholesale tree farm, but the individual landscaping service itself is a retailer. Even the tree farm, like, what was the name of that company that we're familiar with?
Oh,
Who was it? Willis, yeah, Willis. If Willis takes a tree out and plants it in somebody's yard and they pay him, he's a retailer. If Willis takes a tree and sells it to a landscape contractor and the landscape contractor sells it to the ultimate consumer, he's a wholesaler. So we're mixing apples and oranges on what these issues are. And there's serious apples and oranges, because if you want to tell the truth, about what tropical property management is. It is a retail, off-site, commercial landscaping service. Now, I've seen efforts, and I appreciate all the work that's gone on to redraft this ordinance to make it palatable. But if you're going to draft an ordinance and it's going to contain a definition and it's going to accomplish a purpose, I think it ought to be true to the fact. And go ahead and put in your ordinance that we're now going to start allowing retail, off-site, commercial landscaping services to be operated out of ag property. That would be the truth. It's also curious to me how the proposed ordinance refers to agriculture, but nobody has gone back so far to check the definition of agriculture. The first one there, agricultural lands, those in any bona fide agricultural use. The last one, agricultural operation, land use, and associated activities relating to bona fide agricultural production. Now look at the middle one. Doesn't say anything about having to be bona fide. It just says a permitted agricultural use is part of the definition of agriculture. So that essentially you could draft a statute and say anything was agriculture under chapter 9 and put it in chapter 911 and it would be an agricultural use. So I think that puts a burden, a significant burden on the drafter of any legislation not to take advantage of that section. And if you're going to use the middle section of the definition of agriculture, use it in connection with the first definition of agriculture and the third definition of agriculture, and make it at least a bona fide agricultural business. This section was already mentioned. 971.08, agricultural uses. The very first section, before you get down to the new section the staff would like to include in the list of uses under 971.08, at number 17, the very first threshold issue that arises under 971 is agricultural businesses. And there is an exclusion from that section if you're doing wholesaling and processing. I think we've covered that point. These off-site landscaping companies are not doing wholesale, and neither are the tree groves that are selling and installing customers' property, on customers' property, the products that they grow on their tree farm. They're retailers too. So that doesn't apply. The exception doesn't apply. This provision goes on to state that if you want to put a business in agriculture, you've got to go through the special exception process. The proposed ordinance, I don't know how it would square with that. You have one piece of legislation that says this, the one that they propose says that, one goes to the county commission for final approval under special exception, the other only goes to planning and zoning. And then go down and look at the other part under paragraph C1. They may be allowed to locate in A1, 2, and 3 only upon a finding by the reviewing body that such a business are directly related to providing services for active and agricultural operations, and that such uses would not be more appropriately located in a commercial or industrial district. As far as I'm concerned, when I went to the county back in 2015 and told them what was going on, I triggered this section of the ordinances and codes of Indian River County. But it was never mentioned, never brought up, never explored, and it's been ignored throughout this entire process. Now, do we want planning and zoning to be the one to make this finding? Or to review the site plan that would come up? I hate to tell you, but we had a pretty bad experience over at planning and zoning. We basically got the bum rush. And we were looking forward to this day so that we could try to square things up and get it back on an even keel. That's the last thing we want, is to have planning and zoning making that decision, or the decision about or making the finding, or reviewing the site plan. I think you'd be doing yourselves a service on removing this from the code altogether. It would resolve all those sticky problems about whether this service is truly ag, is it not? Is that service putting down fertilizer on my neighbor's yard? Is that ag? It would go back to something sensible and direct and easy to enforce. I had one of the people from the staff, I won't mention any names, I know it's just an off-the-cuff comment. He said, "We like this ratio, it's easy to enforce." And I know one of the reasons at the agriculture meetings, that agriculture committee meetings, that it was suggested, there was original discussion of the fact of whether it ought to be a special exception or administrative approval. And it was suggested, well, almost to the extent, it's too much of a bother to take it all the way to the county commission. I'm asking the question, who's bothered now? Is the bother going to be worse or better? I would suggest that it would be better to remove the bother altogether and grant the Simmons-Campbell amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public wishing to speak on this item, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record. Welcome.
Spencer Simmons, own the property on 7350 37th Street. I would like for Mr. Solari to be here, so if maybe he will need to use the bathroom.
Stepped out, so you can either,
Well-
you can start, or you can let somebody else come up and come back to the podium.
I would prefer to do that if
Okay, anybody else from the public wish to speak on this item, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record.
Morning.
Welcome.
My name's John Terry. I purchased 10 acres on 37th Street last year. I grew up here, graduated from high school, went away, came back a couple of years ago to retire and be with family and friends. And in the process of looking around, I spoke to a lot of family, friends, and acquaintances about, living out west of town, and people like Sean Sexton and others, and they reminded me of what y'all have said about, look, you could have a pig farm move in next door, you could have this move in next door, you could have that move in next door. And so I knew the possibilities. What I didn't realize is that a very successful, very successful commercial business could move in next door and create the issues, the unintended consequences of having a commercial business in agriculture. If I don't understand why it all seems kind of backward and convoluted to me, the whole process. Because if this is really supposed to be ag, then on their original verification affidavit of non-residential farm building, type of structural metal building, use of structure, storage of farm equipment, administrative work, use of site, tree farm, and cattle. Why did they just put down lawn maintenance? Well, they didn't put down lawn maintenance because lawn maintenance is not ag. Now, I realize that they're trying to come up with this formula to sort of retroactively figure out a solution to the problem. And I agree with the last gentleman. I don't see how any kind of ratio thing is just putting a Band-Aid over something that's a wound, and it's not going to cause anything other than just issues down the road. So I'd ask you respectively to consider that the Simmons Campbell, that this is not ag. It's mowing people's yard in Marion Harbor and Johns Island, and that's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Mr. Simmons, did you want to come back up now?
Where should I put this, sir?
Again, Spencer Simmons, 7350 37th Street. I was up here a year ago. That was March 5th is what started this. And, you know, we that have been dealing with this have been to all the meetings. We have been to the Ag Committee meetings. We've been to Planning and Zoning meetings. We really never had an opportunity to truly speak about this because I believe, as Mr. Hendrick said, we kind of always got the bum rush, it felt like, anytime we wanted to try to address some of the issues. And I felt that in order for the citizens and taxpayers to participate in this process, and I believe Mr. Hendricks also had to pay $1,500 to submit an LDR amendment. I would appreciate the opportunity to present my background and be able to even give a chance for any rebuttals. For me being what staff was doing with their background. In the packet that staff presented to you is the section called background. That is what we're here today. But as I read through what staff is presenting, we find that there are items missing and inaccurate in their background narrative. If their narrative is incomplete, then I believe their analysis is somewhat incomplete. First, when Tim Campbell and I requested to speak a year ago about the Caribbean lawn business, we did not do it because of concerns about traffic and property values, but how code enforcement was dealing with a large-scale commercial business setting up shop in Ag 1 zoning. When we were at the code enforcement hearing, we witnessed the code enforcement staff advocating to the code enforcement board to allow Caribbean Lawn to operate without any repercussions their commercial lawn mowing business.
Mr. Simmons, I'm just going to make a recommendation here, and to everyone else, we're not here about the code enforcement board case or what happened there. The board has no authority over that. We're on the LDR amendment to the code.
Mr. Dillon, this has happened to me multiple times. This background is what you guys laid out. I should have the same opportunity to lay out background because I was at the code enforcement hearing, and this is really why we are here. March 5th, I came to this board because what I saw on February 28th, what the code enforcement was doing. This is why we're here. We're not here because we just decided to jump in here. Because of what I presented on the March 5th is what gave the county the idea that something had to be done. And I believe that, as again, I paid $1,500 to speak here. And I apologize if this is a little more than what you want to hear, because you have called me and told me not to call out staff, which I thought was a bit inappropriate, but your office
Mr. Simmons, I'm going to ask you to please.
All right, I apologize. I just wanted
your
to.
Your comments to the LDR, and that's what we're here to discuss.
Well, and I think that
Okay,
we need to kind of go through some of the background, because staff's presented a background which you guys have, and if it's incomplete or things were not are missing, then
okay,
I think
but
that
what Dylan is trying to make clear is that the code enforcement issue has run its course, and that's a separate process.
and
as it
understand
relates
that.
to what we're trying to do today, we do understand that background. So, well, I'll give it back.
That's kind of my point. I don't think that you clearly understand what the background that happened with code enforcement.
Well, if you'd like to go on with your comments.
I appreciate that, thank you. We witnessed that the Code Enforcement Board was allowing them to start their business. Even when the Code Enforcement Board brought up the fact that there was no ag activity at all on the property and that the cart was before the horse, when they questioned the fact that there was no tree farm or ag business of any kind, and that their lawn mowing business could not be an accessory use to a tree farm or nursery because it didn't even exist, staff continued their advocacy for the business and asked them to give them 90 days to start a tree farm. 90 days to start a tree farm. That 90 days came, and there was another hearing. Mr. Campbell actually was at that hearing, and Caribbean Lawn wasn't even at the hearing. Two of the members of that Code Enforcement Board were voting against it because there's nobody even here to even advocate for them because their farm hadn't even started. And then they gave them another 90 days, and there was no more hearings. And then magically, as you guys said, let's let this path play out, and we'll let this go. That just disappeared. All of a sudden, they were in compliance. Now, one of the things that I haven't really seen in any of these backup was that staff had asked the ad extension lady to do a report on the Stoltz's tree farm. The report stated reservations about the legitimacy of the non-existent tree farm. The report questioned the amount of trees or the lack thereof, the location on the property, where they were planted, and the conditions of the trees. This was a report that Code Enforcement had requested, and nobody's seen it. It was never in any of these reports, and they never brought it before Code Enforcement. They never brought it before the ag committees. They never brought it before anybody. That the ag extension said this is game in the system. This is not a tree farm. This is not ag. Then all of a sudden, August 26th, it disappeared. Also, in the second paragraph of the backup, staff makes it basically an erroneous statement saying that the Stoltz described in their affidavit a proposed 8,000 square foot building. As you saw, nowhere in that affidavit or in their attachment to the affidavit is there anything that says an 8,000 square foot tree farm or an 8,000 square foot commercial building. This is one of the issues that we looked at the zoning or at the Code Enforcement hearing, is that this building, an 8,000 square foot building, is being built. I think that was part of what Code Enforcement was a bit surprised at. They built this out of nowhere. They're not storing farm equipment, but a large commercial fleet of trucks for their commercial lawn mowing business. They are not servicing or repairing farm equipment, as we were talking about, but their automotive shop services their commercial fleet of trucks and commercial lawn mowing. They basically have a automotive shop out there for a large commercial fleet of trucks. I believe that to any rational individual who was looking at this was that Caribbean Lawn falsified the affidavit and was clearly misrepresenting their intent and was obviously trying and succeeding in gaming the system. Our concern was that a large-scale standalone commercial lawn mowing service company was being allowed to set up shop in Ag 1 zoning. This is not about someone moving next door to the airport and then start complaining about the noise. This is not about a farmer being a nuisance. This is not about a farmer being a nuisance and we're trying to shut a farmer down. I thought that one of the purposes of Code Enforcement was to ensure that businesses were in their applicable zoning districts, that the commercial buildings were not being built without a permit unless it is a non-residential farm building, which Caribbean Lawn building clearly is not. Our current LDR regulates landscaping services as a principal contractor trade type of use. And this is to be a heavy commercial or industrial district. This is supposed to be in heavy commercial or industrial district. That's in the LDR. where storage of vehicles, equipment, and various supplies and materials are allowed. So this should be in heavy commercial or an industrial district, these types of businesses. Think about that for a moment. This type of business is supposed to be located, operated in these zoning districts, non-residential zoning districts. They don't significantly have adverse impact upon nearby properties, as per the current LDR. This type of business in the heavy commercial industrial districts are not allowed in neighborhoods. Nobody wants them next door to their homes, farms, or ranches. So if this is the case, why are we now trying to allow them to be in the ag district where you do have farms, homes, and ranches? At the March 5th Board of County Commission meeting, staff expressed fear of somehow violating the Florida Right to Farm Act. Commercial off-site lawn mowing services do not constitute what the state legislature has determined to protect, which I'm hoping you are here to protect, which is agricultural production and agritourism. Even the Agricultural Advisory Committee stated that lawn mowing is not farming. Also, if you look at the federal regulation 29 CFR 780.206, and I can give you a copy of that, and it's in there about planting and lawn mowing. In section B, it states that the planting of trees and bushes on residential businesses or public property is not agriculture when it is done by employees of an employer who has not grown the trees and bushes, or who, if he has grown them, engages in the planting operation as an incidental, as we have in our accessory saying, not to his farming operation, but to the landscaping operation, which I believe we've been talking about. This is not farming, and it's not incidental, it's their primary, which includes principally the laying of sod. Now, if you want to be sure that there is no ambiguity in that statement in section C, it states that mowing of lawns, except where it can be considered incidental to farming operation, is not agricultural work. So this is really about mowing grass. This is really not even about landscaping, going and planting a tree. This is about going out and mowing other people's lawns. The March 5th commission meeting was where we made our presentation, and after our presentation, you, the commissioners, had grave concerns on what was transpiring in the ag district. At that meeting, Commissioner Solari, you had concerns relating to constructing the 8,000 square foot building without a permit, and also of you having concerns that individuals and businesses were gaming the system. Kind of a lopsided interpretation of the Right to Farm Act. We kind of got to where we're at today. When staff presented their LDR amendment on June 18, 2019, it did not address any of the concerns we brought up. As you read staff's first LDR amendment, it specifically was allowing commercial lawn mowing companies in the ag district, a business that is supposed to be in heavy commercial industrial zoning districts now into ag. And that's when I had to pay my $1,500 to put together an LDR amendment. It is clear that Caribbean Lawn is not an accessory use, but the primary business being used on that property. Since mowing grass has nothing to do with farming, it has nothing to do with the Right to Farm Act. So I think we can pretty much push that idea away, that it's got nothing to do with the right to farm. All this really boils down to what is determined as an accessory use. Commissioner Solari, at that March 5th meeting, you asked the question about accessory use. And I think this is where this whole 50% came up, because Stan Bowling, at that time the community development director, he said that, and I quote, the definition for accessory use in the county's list a couple of factors, and the main one being area, the area of cultivation and nursery. As you read through both of staff's LDR amendments, the only criteria that they choose to interpret the definition of accessory use is with that one four-letter word, area. Accessory use is a use which clearly is incidental. That is the very first word, is clearly incidental to, customarily found in association with, and serves a principal use. It serves a principal use. It's not the principal use. It's located on the same lot as the principal use. It's subordinate in purpose, and then we get that one word, area. And even when staff is presenting, they say subordinate in area. They forget that word purpose. Subordinate in purpose, comma, area. It's got to be subordinate to the purpose, which should be farming and ag. They completely ignore the definition and set forth in the LDRs and want to hang their hat on the one word area and build their entire argument on that. Staff's alternative LDR amendment is stating that the standalone mowing services are not allowed, which I believe is the only reason we are here. Caribbean Lawn, as well as Tropical Property Management, are standalone lawn mowing service companies that have been established for more than 15 years. In Caribbean Lawn's case, there was no established tree farm or any farm activity when they set up shop. And I don't believe they really have a farm out there now. Staff wants you to focus only on one aspect, one word in the accessory use definition. Staff starts this whole line of thought that if somehow the area is less than 50%, that somehow that should be the main or only criteria. Accessory use versus principal use. 49% is accessory to 51% principal on a farm or a ranch. Really? They're pulling this area argument out of whole cloth. Even the definition of the word accessory, if you just look at the word accessory, states contributing to or aiding an activity or process in a minor way. That's what accessory, the word accessory means. It's subsidiary or supplemental. In any farm or ag activity, the percentage of land used for production is the most important part. If I'm setting up a ranch or a tree farm or a grove, I'm not going to take 100 acres and only put 50 up in a tree farm, and then I'll have the 50 doing whatever. If I'm a true farmer, I'm going to squeeze out every ounce of land on that property for production of my primary product, whatever it may be. The question is, it really is incidental to what? Farming or agricultural activities. How is off-site commercial lawn mowing service an accessory use to any farming or agricultural activity? Somehow staff is only looking at the thought that allowing lawn mowing services into ag lands. Are we going to say if that I have a grove and I can put half the grove in or half of the farm in and then just do whatever I want on the other end? So the real question is, what should be allowed as an accessory use to an ag activity? What would be an accessory use to, say, a nursery or a tree farm? I think it should relate to the farming activity. If my principal business is a tree farm or a nursery, then I plant a tree or plant whatever on my farm, and then I take it out, and I'm not completely, I would like to have amended my LDR, but I didn't have another $1,500 to maybe amend the LDR. But they discussed the ideal that somehow we look to West Palm Beach. And if you go down to West Palm Beach, there's even articles in the Palm Beach Post of the nightmare they're having down there with these types of businesses. 37th Street is a 1 mile street. And if you allow this to happen, there could be 2 or 3 of these types of businesses in. One of the issues that came before the Agricultural Advisory Committee was the ideal of the building a building that is a non-residential ag building. And they didn't even want to have to fill out any paperwork. And I see their point. You know what? This is an intrusion. We don't have to pull a permit. Why do I have to fill out the paperwork? So they're basically saying, well, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. So honestly, anybody could just throw up a building out there, and if they don't get caught,